Welcome to this very special session at Tata Literature Live 2021, the Mumbai International Literature Festival, co-sponsored by Tata Steel and Tata Projects and powered by Godrej. Earlier this year, we lost our executive director, Shashi Baliga. She had been instrumental in the setting up of the festival, along with founder Anil Dharkar, whom we also lost suddenly. She was the conscious keeper at Literature Live and passionate about including as much diversity in content and representation at the festival as possible. In her honor, the festival has decided to name a session at each edition celebrating women, the Shashi Baliga Memorial Session. Today, we remember her guidance, her smile, and her tenacity with a short film. Shashi, we miss you. And now on to celebrating women, the Shashi Baliga Memorial Session. We couldn't have asked for a better inaugural session. Indefatigable, a portrait of the writer as a feminist icon. Rebecca Solnit in conversation with Menaka Guruswamy. We will be taking questions from the audience towards the end of the session, so please do leave your questions in the comment section. Today, we have Rebecca Solnit joining us from all the way from San Francisco. She is a writer, historian, and an activist. She is the author of more than 20 books on feminism, Western and urban history, popular power, social change and insurrection, wandering and walking, hope and catastrophe. In conversation with Rebecca, we have Dr. Menaka Guruswamy, a senior advocate at the Supreme Court of India. She was one of the key forces behind the successful landmark legal battle against Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code that criminalized same-sex relations. Her practice covers constitutional, commercial, and criminal law. Without much ado, I request our speakers to take the spotlight.
Rebecca Solnit, how absolutely wonderful to have you here. I have 1,000 questions. Let's start with the first one. 2008, you write this fabulous book on how men explain things to us. Why do men explain things to us, Rebecca? I think you have to unmute yourself.
I think one of patriarchy's central assumptions is that men are as inherently full of knowledge as women are inherently empty of it, and in some sort of monstrous impregnation metaphor, they're going to deposit their information upon us. But it's also, I think, the pleasure of hearing oneself hold forth and the expectation that women will be admiring, respectful, anything other than equal or expert. And I wrote that essay in 2008, and since then have heard from doctors, astronomers, carpenters, lawyers, every woman in every imaginable field talking about being treated as ignorant, having things explained to them by people who don't know what they're talking about, and etc. And The important thing, though, about that essay, I always feel that I didn't understand until I actually wrote it. I thought I was going to write a very amusing essay, literally, about men explaining things to us, is that the broader issue is women lacking credibility when we speak, which prevents us from having equal standing when we testify that a crime has been committed, that violence is going on. Of course, in both our countries, we've had legal systems in which women don't have equal political and legal power. So it was really about inequality of voice, which I think is at the root of gender inequality and something we're struggling to level out now, which with, of course, lots of backlash.
Sure, and you start this essay by discussing an event, right, where you go to a party and the host kind of, latches on to you and starts telling you about a book, River of Shadows, on the photographer and cinema pioneer Muybridge, and the technological Wild West, which you in fact wrote. But the host begins to tell you about this brilliant book, which you need to read, and explains the book to you.
Yeah, exactly. And it's also about a habit of talking without listening. I said I had written a book about Muybridge, and he was like, oh, you need to know about the very important book about Muybridge that just came out. Just a little bit more curiosity and listening. He might have said, what's your book called? And then it would turn out that, the book he wanted to tell me about was my book. But my friend kept interjecting, that's her book. And of course, that's a fairly amusing anecdote. But in the essay, I went on to talk about a woman running out of her house naked in the middle of the night, screaming that her husband was trying to kill her. A story told to me by a man who thought it was funny and assumed that the woman must be crazy because he couldn't imagine that the upper middle class white husband was trying to kill his wife, even though upper middle class white men do this quite regularly. But he found it incredibly easy to imagine that the woman was crazy, by which he meant she was not capable of bearing witness to her. Her own experience, was not believable, was not somebody to listen to. So unbelievability, incredibility, inaudibility is a slippery slope. It can be as silly as that conversation I had, or it can be lethal if you say somebody's trying to kill me and people think you are overwrought and unbelievable.
And in this same book, The River of Shadows, you also set a scene of California. This life is set within California, and California as a place of tech innovation and reinvention. And you're in California, so California. What's the world of tech feel like to you? What does our life in tech feel like to you? What does this life driven by algorithms feel like to you?
We live it two ways. I'm here in San Francisco, which is a place I used to be so proud of. It's the birthplace of the Sierra Club and the environmental movement, the place where Harvey Milk became the first out gay elected politician in this country, a place that produced a lot of great poets and et cetera. But in more recent years, we're global headquarters for Facebook, Apple, Google, and a lot of other corporations that have produced the monstrous new algorithm-driven surveillance, providing technology that's really changed the world. And it's consumed San Francisco. So in some ways, I experience it the way all of us do, in that everybody's walking around staring at their phone, that, rumors and misinformation spread in new ways. The news media has been undermined by by other online things tech taking all the advertising revenue away from newspapers, which has weakened democracy in this country. But we also experience it because these people, are a kind of new dominant population in the region. There's a lot of libertarian billionaires who believe because they made a lot of money, they have the solution to everything from climate change to education, and who spend some of their money trying to intervene in the political process in often quite misguided ways. And it's a culture that's been really quite destructive in a lot of ways, and something that we were looking at a lot more when it was a lot more confrontational about 7 or 8 years ago, was a huge amount of evictions, the destruction of old businesses, et cetera. And so the replacement of a deeply rooted long-term and diverse culture economically and racially with a much more homogenous culture, both homogenous and it's mostly white and Asian American, and that a lot of chain stores and have replaced small local businesses. So it's almost been a kind of an amnesia for the region, and also a kind of ruthlessness that's produced epidemics of homelessness and, and a lot of anxiety of people feeling uprooted and disoriented in various ways because things have changed so much. So it's a very strange place to be these days. And just there's also kind of shame associated with it. When I look at the genocide in Myanmar, Burma, knowing that Facebook played a crucial role in it, when I look at the Brexit elections, when I look at how Facebook, to a lesser extent, Twitter, et cetera, are providing the tools for corruption, for genocide, for the manipulation of consciousness, for the loss of privacy. It's not embarrassing, which is too light a word. It's a bit of a nightmare to be here and to know that this is what's producing this destructiveness.
And yet, in 2005, before we faced the full impact of tech in everything that we do, you write a field guide to getting lost, right? To kind of lose yourself completely. To lose yourself, you say, a voluptuous surrender, lost in your arms, lost to the world, utterly immersed in what is present. Is it possible in today's world to lose oneself with tech all around us, with being connected all the time? Do you lose yourself anymore?
I do. I still navigate by partial knowledge and exploration, that getting lost a little bit because you kind of know where you are, but not exactly. But I wrote that book partly because people were becoming more and more enveloped in their bubbles of technology, including navigating by phones, and other devices. And I've also done 3 atlases, which were very much about celebrating what maps do. You study a map and you gradually absorb its knowledge. You still have to experiment a little bit, but you are the boss of the map, whereas your phone telling you what to do is the boss of you. And the 100th time you go someplace, you may be obeying it as blindly as the first time you used it. Whereas with a map, the map gradually becomes superfluous because you become the map, you become the atlas, you know where you are. So for me, getting lost was about going beyond what you know, talking to strangers, discovering, venturing out into the world in an unmediated way. And so it's written really against what tech was offering us, which was constant mediation, which is what they profit off, and we, in I think deeper psychic ways, lose from.
And these wanderings also take you to a little village where you're trying to track down George Orwell's home. In your newest work called Orwell's Roses, and Rebecca's beautiful new book, kind of centers around George Orwell, who rents this lovely little cottage between 1936 to 1948, somewhere in England. Tell us about how you track this down, because you are also a master researcher and your books make it clear the rigor with which you track this down. How do you think of George Orwell, this house he occupies? How do you find it? And then you do more.
Of course, the fact that Orwell was born in India makes me wonder if India will ever claim him from England, where he moved when he was 1 year old. His father was, of course, a sub-deputy opium agent in Motihari, which I'm probably mispronouncing. But no, my friend Sam who's a filmmaker, Sam Green, thought he might do a documentary about trees. We're talking about trees planted about notable people in the summer of 2017. I knew an essay of Orwell's where he talks about planting trees and roses very well. And Sam got very excited and wanted to know if the trees were still growing, we might visit them. I went online, figured out where they would have been in Wellington, Hertfordshire, England. Sam wrote a letter to the address. We didn't hear back. I was on book tour in the UK, went to the cottage, which isn't very charming now, but in Orwell's time, I think, I don't think it had electricity. It didn't have indoor, I think it had a kitchen sink, but no indoor toilet. You know, it was quite primitive in a lot of ways and would flood and leak and etc. But he loved being in the country. He was a passionate gardener. It was kind of his first real home as an adult, and the place he moved to so he could get married and set himself up as a writer. So it's very meaningful to him. But so I went looking for the fruit trees for Sam, and the lovely people who live in the cottage told me they'd been cut down in the 1990s, but his roses were still growing. And that begat the book, because I thought, and two things happened. One, I was quite blown away to have these living organisms that had been tended by Orwell himself bring me so much closer to him as a living, you know, breathing person, rather than just this very removed figure who had written all these books that had been so formative for me. But the other thing is, I realized, although I'd known the essay most of my adult life in which he talks about it, I hadn't thought hard enough about what it meant that this great anti-fascist, anti-authoritarian writer had also planted and tended and loved roses. And for a lot of people on the left, they're seen as indulgent, superfluous, etc. When he wrote for the left-wing magazine Tribune, somebody wrote into him to tell him that flowers are bourgeois, which I think is kind of hilarious, but also something we all know from hanging out with the left.
Yeah.
And Orwell himself was, you know, defended flowers, but I thought it raised larger questions about what in a passionately dedicated life, what role does beauty, pleasure, joy, leisure play? How do these things relate? How do they relate in Orwell's life? And I'm both mortified to have written another book along with Muybridge about a middle-class white Englishman, but I felt like, you know, feminist, queer people, women, marginalized people, people of color have been integrating beauty and pleasure and joy in their activism, but were often dismissed. But it felt like Orwell was unassailable. If you can show that he was actually an advocate for all these things the left thinks that it denounces as frivolous, luxurious, superfluous, then you can really shift the political argument, or at least look at the counter arguments, which he mounts in his own writing in ways I think people hadn't looked at. And because I agree with them in some ways, and because it was exciting to find this other Orwell, I got to revisit in this book.
And in this book, you know, roses mean more than just objects of beauty and desire, or little pleasures also. Roses, you talk about the bread and roses being a battle cry of the American women's rights movement. What do roses mean symbolically in the context of political revolutions?
Roses mean everything. They're spiritual symbols of the Virgin Mary, erotic symbols, and everything else. And I wanted to let them be everything, to be themselves and their symbolic and allegorical realities, to stand in for the plant, or open up questions about the plant kingdom and flowering plants, and also to be, you know, a capitalist commodity. I went to the horrific rose growing industry in Colombia in South America, which supplies 90% of the commercial roses sold in the United States. But in some ways, the most exciting and joyous discovery for me was looking at the origin of the phrase bread and roses. The phrase is extremely well known here, but its real meanings, I don't think, have been unpacked in decades. It originates with a woman campaigning for women's right to vote in 1910. In her conversation with two farm women and the woman servant they employed, where they pulled out a phrase from her stump speech, her campaign speech for women's right to vote, about "we fight for bread but flowers too," which became bread and roses. And bread is what almost every labor movement, left-wing movement, economic justice movement has worked for, which is the basic necessities of life: food, clothing, shelter. We might add education and medical access, medical care, vaccines to them too now. And but Rose's was this radical assertion that human beings are more subtle and complex and deep than that. We also need beauty, pleasure, joy, leisure, culture, nature, and we need the freedom and often the privacy in which to determine what those things will be to us individually. We might all need the same bread, but we need different roses from each other. So it's a really radical assertion about the complexity and subtlety of human nature, and that human beings' needs should be fully met, and they include beauty, culture, nature, and these other things. And I found it quite exciting because you can look at so much of what political discourse is about, leftist utilitarianism, and often Puritanism is about, and see that they take care of the bread, but they often cut out the roses as frivolous, decadent, unnecessary. Part of what was interesting about me with Orwell as a passionate gardener is it raises a question I've often had in other ways. What are the things we need to do that to other people may look frivolous, self-indulgent, trite, etc., but that are actually necessary to the passionately, to the public service we do, to the important work we do. If we had all the time in the world, or when you and I finally get to go out for a drink somewhere in India, or when you come to San Francisco, what is it that you do that makes your amazing legal human rights work possible? And Orwell did this writing that was tremendously powerful and important about totalitarianism, fascism, propaganda. And it seems like he also needed to do this other business of gardening, of wandering, of watching the weather, raising his chickens and goats, milking them and collecting the eggs, etc. So what are the things we need to do besides our most central and important purpose that make it possible to do that, was one of the questions of the book.
You've got this great bit in the book where you talk about Stalin attempting to subordinate nature by growing lemons in sub-zero temperatures. How do you arrive at this? How do you think of this stuff? How do you track it down? How do you research it?
Being a researcher is a bit like getting lost. I think people who have research assistants can send them out to find what they already expect is out there in the world, but not to find what you don't expect it. And I was reading a footnote in an academic paper led me to discover that one of the inspirations for Orwell's final masterpiece, 1984, was scientists talking about the repression of Darwinism and scientific truth, particularly around plants, agronomy, and agriculture in the Soviet Union, which then led me to discover that not only was Stalin obsessed both with wheat production, the bread and roses, but also with his own luxurious gardens and his several dachas around the Soviet Union, and with forcing lemons to grow in impossible conditions, essentially bullying lemon trees the way he bullied human beings, with this sense that you could force things to change, to become something they weren't. And it felt like the lemon trees were stand-ins for human nature, although I think you can force human beings to at least pretend to adapt in ways you can't lemon trees. So it became kind of a symbol for ideology over reality, ideology over science and empiricism. In these kinds of battles we still have about how you arrive at truth, or how you erase it and replace it with whatever's ideologically expedient. Something we still, under the shadow of Trump here and you with Modi and etc., are living through again. It's because our world so resembles some of the, so much of what Orwell wrote about, that it felt like looking at him in this moment was relevant, as well as how he faced, an incredibly difficult and decisive time might help us think about what each of us needs to do in our equally difficult and decisive time around climate, around authoritarianism, around racial nationalism, misogyny, and the rest.
Which takes me to the favorite topic of my, for me to think about, which is illiberal democracies and the rise of them all over the world. Now, America's just had a transition of power, just about had a transition of power, and you have the Democrats back in power. Is that the end of white nationalism?
In my dreams, there was a beautiful essay by the Black liberation writer Michelle Alexander a few years ago that said, "We are not the resistance, they're the resistance." This was back during the Trump era when progressives, the left, human rights activists, voting rights activists were often called the resistance. And her point was, we are the mighty river they're trying to dam. And it was a beautiful essay and something I agree with. The United States will be a non-white majority country in a little over 2 decades. So much has changed since I was young, and I'm definitely not young anymore. I grew up in a country where almost nobody but white men held positions of political power. We'd had one non-white Supreme Court justice, no woman until I was an adult. Never had a well, we finally had a Black president when I was in my 40s, and with Backlash. So I see what's happening as backlash, but backlash is often treated as something very, that you can just shove aside. But the US is in a death struggle about whether democracy and an increasingly non-white majority that's also and include, not just about race, it's about women, about queer people, about a profound egalitarianism and inclusiveness, non-Western worldviews, indigenous worldviews, et cetera. I think it's also about compassion and, about climate justice, about environmental thinking. It's actually, and the way in which I think a lot of people get this wrong is we often act as though the right is overreacting. I think they're actually very correct. We are trying to replace an old white supremacist, misogynist, homophobic, patriarchal culture with something better, more horizontal, more inclusive. They know it whether or not we do. And the only way they can win is by toppling democracy itself, by corrupting elections. Their desperation is why they attempted to overthrow the election of Biden. So it's actually a terrifying time in which the Republican Party has become a kind of neo-fascist party without regard for law, for truth, for rights, for voting rights, etc. And the next few years decide which will win. So it's exhilarating if, in Michelle Alexander's terms, the river overcomes the dam. Otherwise the dam may overcome the river for generations, in the course of which so many kinds of destruction, including climate destruction, something I work on a lot, will prevail because they're deeply anti-environmental, pro-corporate, pro-fossil fuel, among their many other attributes.
And yet, when we talk about the resurgence, say in America, of white nationalism, I often think about the fact that women are voting in both our democracies, in larger numbers than before. In many parts of India, women actually outnumber men when casting their votes. In America as well, the number of women voting has actually steadily gone up. And yet women are not seen as a, important political constituency. The rights, the interests of women as distinct from men is not actually seen as a viable voting, a political manifesto. Why is this the case, and how do you improve it?
you have to talk about it intersectionally, in that white women are pretty evenly divided between Republican and Democratic. Women in every category are more progressive than men, more willing to support social services, environmental policies, human rights, voting rights, etc. But we do have, women of color vote for Republicans almost not at all. White women are divided. I'm Jewish, I'm college educated, I'm a Californian. I belong to many categories of women that hardly vote for Republicans at all, but I also belong to the category of white women who voted 48% for Trump in 2016. I don't remember what it was in 2020. And, so you have women who serve patriarchy, or women for whom their whiteness is a more important symbol. And often these are women who are part of the right-wing evangelical church, women who live in conservative places in the country, where I think they're mostly exposed to right-wing media and propaganda, etc. Something remarkable I found out during the 2018 elections, talking to door-to-door canvassers, was that, particularly because we now have a lot of vote by mail, you fill out your ballot at home, a lot of women in these patriarchal households are either prevented from voting and participating fully, or are told who to vote for. And I think that the ballot box, where nobody knew how you filled your ballot out, was actually part of what the secrecy of the ballot was something that changed in the 19th or early 20th century in a lot of countries. There's no secrecy if your husband, is at the table with you. So there's also an interesting thing where I think that there's some fear and domination happening in some of these places. When I did my research, I found that there were Texas women secretly organizing to vote Democratic and support Democratic candidates. The shock was that they were doing it secretly because they didn't dare to not be Republican in their communities. So I think about these women who are so deeply entrenched in these communities, which doesn't justify them. Some of them are perpetrating it. If you vote for a white supremacist, for a racist, but there's a larger question also of how women get, duped, dupe's not the word, how women choose to, or manipulated into, or pressured into, or corrupted into voting against their own interests, which of course working class white people have been doing for a long time. Women voting against abortion rights, working class people voting for tax cuts for billionaires and loss of social services for themselves, economic inequality, etc. It's complicated. That was a long answer.
Thank you. No, it was a great answer, but I think, I've just started a book called White Fragility. And I'll tell you how it goes, but we're only a couple of minutes to questions. So I have one last question for you, Rebecca. What about our world today makes you excited and happy and optimistic?
I'm now 60 years old. I like to say I'm exactly the same age as the Berlin Wall and doing much better than it. I'm just Martin Luther King said the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. Many things have gotten worse in my lifetime, notably the climate and the environment in some ways, although I was born into a world with almost no environmental consciousness in the industrialized world, and a lot of, indigenous and rural people certainly had it. But, I was born into a world in which inequality around race, around gender, the criminalization of queer people was normal, in which many rights were not even really concepts. And I've seen things change so much in my lifetime. To have a Black woman vice president in this country is something that would have been inconceivable. Black, let me rephrase that, Black and half South Asian, Black and half Indian. And, the world. Yeah, the world has changed profoundly and in many ways for the better. the ideas, the ways we think about the world, I think in some ways we've just, that there are much broader channels of communitarian, collaborative, and compassionate thought that are very different. The colonialism that was in many parts of the Western world treated as natural and normal, is different. One of the things that made me most hopeful, I got involved in Native American land rights in the early 1990s when non-Native people thought of Native people as having disappeared, not being part of the conversation, not being 20th century in some ways, and seeing how profoundly Native people have become visible, reclaimed land rights, culture, being given a lot more respect. It's now very normal to open a meeting in the United States by saying, I am on the unceded territory. I myself could say, I am on the unceded territory now of the Ramaytush Ohlone people. And so to see those kinds of changes is to see a lot of ideas that I think are generous, compassionate, egalitarian prevail over a much uglier world in many ways. So that makes me hopeful at the same time that the climate crisis and the backlash of, patriarchal, white nationalism here, ethnic nationalism elsewhere in the world terrifies me, and of course the climate crisis. So, the work continues.
So on that note of hope, let's start with these questions, and they're just rolling in. Shanti Rao says, can you talk about how the environmental crisis also disproportionately affects people based on their gender class, while elite men in power are responsible for a major part of it?
I wish we had a world where the more impacted you were, the more you were empowered to vote. If the people of the Pacific Islands and Bangladesh were voting on whether we were going to allow sea level rise rather than, billionaires with private, or politicians with private jets who are really rootless. The climate crisis is a racial justice crisis. We have a wonderful Black environmentalist named Hopkins here who said a few years ago that you cannot have fossil fuel extraction without racism because all fossil fuel extraction poisons its local communities. It's almost always done on Indigenous and people of color's land. Women, because they don't abandon children, because they have less social and economic mobility, tend to be more impacted in all climate crises. So it's, and of course, I'm talking to you from the country that produced some of, the most emissions historically, and where our emissions per capita are many times higher than people in India's. And so we also have that. So it is partly a crisis of equality. And what we saw in Glasgow are the wealthy countries that benefited and continue to benefit from the status quo of the fossil fuel economy, willing to make the great transition, or not. And we can see both activism pushing them forward and vested interest dragging them back. And I think a lot of great stuff happened, specifically because of that activism. We have definitely shifted. I think we were before Glasgow, in terms of global agreements, at a world of 2.6 degrees of warming. We're now at 1.8 degrees, which is unacceptable, but getting closer to where we need to be. So yeah, and I've also been around the climate movement long enough to see it go from being kind of small, polite, ineffectual, focused on austerity, we have to give these things up, to a kind of beautiful, radical inclusiveness that we cannot address the climate without addressing inequality, but also that the basic job is to make a better world, because fossil fuels have made I think people in India know about air quality, a filthy world, a poisonous world, an unequal world, a world with incredibly corrosive power, whether you're talking about monarchies in the Middle East, fossil fuel corporations, extractivism, etc. So it's very much like what I was describing in my own country, a kind of struggle for the fate of the world, and one that's both exhilarating because so much progress has been made. The even the way we think about it and talk about it, what's possible has changed so much. The capacity to leave fossil fuel behind because of the growth of renewable technologies is exciting, but the disasters everywhere get more and more overwhelming. The window gets narrower and narrower to do what we need to do.
Thank you for that. So there's another question. It says, you spoke beautifully about compassion in today's age. How does the cancel culture from the left rupture this?
And I think, to talk like a teenager, mean people are everywhere. There's a lot of, two great forces in the American left are the Black church, which has always had a spirit of generosity and kindness, a kind of visionary prophetic voice. And, and although I don't think it's talked about much this way, Buddhism has directly and indirectly, with the idea of compassion for all beings and a bit of restraint about leaping to conclusions, and kindness around race, around gender, around sexuality and sexual orientation, around disability and body types has also been a huge influence. But there's people across the spectrum who are Puritans, who are from what the climate journalist David Roberts once coined the doing it wrong brigade, who think that their great contribution to, changing the world is to tell everyone what they're doing wrong and to punish anyone who doesn't have exactly the right language or framework, who doesn't have this week's vocabulary. So, I think cancel culture is a stupid term that the right has co-opted and is using constantly to mean I can say anything I want, but if you say what I said was racist or homophobic or sexist or wrong, that's cancel culture, and it's back to white fragility. It's these people who are used to being able to say any horrible thing without consequences, now facing a world in which other people can say, actually, that's racist and wrong, actually, that's offensive, actually, and so it's a kind of fragility about coexisting with diversity of opinion, about being fact-checked. So, the left has its versions, but whatever the hell the left is, which is one of my questions in this book about Orwell as well, because we call Stalinists the left, even though that was, an authoritarianism approaching totalitarianism, or maybe more than approaching it. And we call, what I want the left to be is people passionately committed to universal equality and, indelible human rights. So, so it's all a muddle would be the very short summary.
Thank you. So I think we have 2 minutes to go. So here's a question from me. If there's a young Indian girl watching you today, and she wanted to grow up and be a writer, what would you say to her that she'd have to do?
Pay attention to stories, try and find what are the stories that no one else can tell that she was born to tell. Pay attention to what's going on around her. Question authority, question the dominant narratives, find the cracks in what things are supposed to be, who she's supposed to be. And find her people, find the people who value her, who support her, who encourage her, who inspire her. Find the people she wants to listen to and the people who will listen to her. And, and find the feminism that will support her voice.
Find the feminism that will support her voice. Rebecca Solnit, thank you so much for everything that you do, for your views, books, for just bringing knowledge, learning, and joy to so many of us.
My pleasure. Next time I hope to be there in person. It's an honor to talk to you, and thank you everyone for listening, and thank you, feminism.
Thank you so much, Rebecca and Menika. I am so thrilled and honored to be a part and a witness of this conversation. And of course, a big thanks to our audience for joining us today for this inaugural session at Tata Literature Live 2021, the Mumbai International Literature Festival, co-sponsored by Tata Steel and Tata Projects and powered by Godrej. If you liked today's session, then do check out Perchance to Dream, How a Generation of Women Fought Their Battles on 21st November, 12 p.m. to 12:45 p.m. IST. Rebecca Solnit's Recollections of My Non-Existence is available to purchase with our knowledge partner, landmarkexcite.com. Thank you so much again.